the topic of this presentation is about labeling of food supplements. I know here it's mainly a show about ingredients and not so many finished products. However, this topic may also interest you, for instance, for your customers. You're selling your ingredient to customers. Well, you may be interested to know about how to label the final product and to give concrete advice to your customers about how to make a label in compliance with the regulation in the EU. So it's about food supplement labeling. It's not about functional foods, drinks, or other kinds of foodstuffs. So very specific to food supplements in the EU. So if you want to design a food supplement label, first of all, if you do that in your company, you will have to think about what is the legislation in place. What do I need to know, first of all, before designing my food supplement label? Well, the first, let's say it's quite difficult. We have to admit, if you want to design a food supplement label, the legislation is quite complex and very diverse in the EU nowadays. So the applicable rules. First of all, you have to look at EU legislation, and we call it horizontal EU legislation. It means that it's an EU legislation applying to all food products. This is why we call it horizontal EU legislation. So what do we mean here? For food supplements label, you have to be aware, first of all, of the General Food Labeling Directive from 2002. Here I will be quite technical. I will name legislations. Maybe it's boring if you're not into the regulatory affairs area, but it's for your reference, and maybe some of you are working in regulatory affairs. So you have to know the General Food Labeling Directive from 2002, also the General Nutrition Labeling Directive. Here I put for RDAs. You will understand later on, I will give you examples of food supplement labels and what do we mean by RDAs, recommended daily allowances. You will understand why after. It's just to give you here all the applicable legislation for food supplement labels. On top of that, in the EU, quite complicated. You have other pieces of EU legislation on for food supplements labeling, not only to food supplements, but to all other foodstuffs. For instance, a law on the labeling of foods containing caffeine, a law on foods containing phytosterols, phytostanols, a law for foods containing sweetener, aspartame, polyols. And here you will find labeling provisions. So you see it's very diffuse, you have to be aware of many pieces of EU legislation before you start designing your label. Fortunately, in the EU, we have had a recent development. The European Commission was aware that the legislation was quite confusing and complicated. So what they did, they adopted a new regulation by repealing all this legislation and putting them only in one piece of legislation. So it was a useful simplification exercise from the Commission to have only one text dealing with food labeling in the EU. And you have the reference here, the regulation 1169 from 2011. So this is the new food labeling regulation where you can find all the key principles for the labeling of foods in general. And I put the date underneath. It will become applicable in December 2014. So you see, we are still in transition period, let's say. Nowadays, if you do a food supplement label, you have to open all the other legislation, 2000, nutrition labeling, all the other pieces of legislation. After December 2014, we will have one unique legislation dealing with labeling of food products. Okay? So that was the first, let's say, legislation to be aware of, EU horizontal legislation. On top of that, it's not the end. You have, okay, one single legislation, but on top of that, you have to be aware that many other acts in the EU have labeling provisions. For instance, under the GMO regulation, you will find labeling rules. Under the food additive regulation, again, you may find labeling provisions. For instance, lately they have adopted a warning statement for certain colors, if you use a food color, and for certain ones, they have adopted a provision to put a warning statement for the hyperactivity of children for certain colors. And we call them the ASO colors, the E100, etc. So again, be aware that you have to combine many pieces of legislation in order to have a complete picture of the legislation applying to the label of food supplements. Again, you may find rules in the Lot Code Directive, in the Nutrition and Health Claims Regulation, the regulation on fortification, and all the novel food decisions. In those decisions, you will find how to label the novel food ingredient. You may find warning statements for your ingredient. So you see that labeling is a complex task. You have to open different pieces of legislation. So that was the first level, horizontal EU legislation. On top of that, we talk here about food supplement labeling. So you have to open the food supplement directive in the EU to understand what are the labeling rules for food supplements. And last, you have to know that certain countries, again, have established certain labeling provisions for food supplements. Here I put example. Let's take Belgium. They have a list of plants to be used in food supplements. And in that list, you will find specific warning statements for certain botanical extracts. So again, you have to know that and put this warning statement on your label. So you see, you have to combine all these different pieces of legislation in order to have your complete picture of what is your food supplement label and how to make it compliant with EU and national legislation. Okay, I hope you're not demotivated now to make a label. Let's take an example. Let's have an example of food supplement label. So maybe it's too small for you. I will guide you. So first of all, the name under which the product is sold. In the EU, we have an official name. It's food supplement. It's not dietary supplement. It's not health supplement like in Singapore or other Asian countries. So in the EU, it's food supplement, and in each country, you have an official translation, complément alimentaire in French, for instance, and not another name, first of all. Then you have to put on your label the names of the categories of nutrients or substances that characterize your product. And here it's interesting. So what can you put? You put food supplement with a plant extract, for instance, or food supplement on the basis of vitamins and minerals. Here we would advise you to keep it very general, just to state vitamins, minerals, or plants. Why? Because of the claims regulation. We would not advise you to put food supplement with lycopene or with coenzyme Q10, for instance. Keep it general, keep it as neutral as possible in order not to have any challenge with authorities if you put a specific ingredient name that did not get any health claim in the EU, okay? Then you have to put in the EU for food supplement, you have to put 3 warning statements specific to food supplements. You have a list here, do not exceed the stated recommended daily dose, okay? They should not be used as a substitute for a varied diet, and to be stored out of the reach of young children. So, quite simple. In the US, they have similar statements that is quite, let's say, global. Then you have, if you use a health or nutrition claim, you have to put another statement on the importance of a healthy and balanced diet, just for your information. And this, you find that in the claims regulation in the EU. Then on your food supplement label, you have to put the daily recommended dose. Like, for instance, take 1 or 2 sachets per day or take 3 capsules a day. This is also mandatory, of course. Then you have to declare on your label the amount of ingredients per daily dose. This is also mandatory. Let's say you use vitamin C and coenzyme Q10 in your food supplement. Well, on the label, you are obliged to give the amount of CoQ10 and vitamin per daily dose. This is the condition for food supplements. We don't care about the amount of fiber or proteins or calories. This is not relevant to food supplements. For food supplements, you have to give the daily amount of the active ingredients, not about food additives again. Active ingredients, ingredients having a nutritional or physiological effect in the product. And last, for vitamins and minerals, you have to give the percentage in relation to the RDAs. Maybe it's technical for you. Let's say you used vitamin D in your food supplement. You give the amount per day. On top of that, you have to give the percentage in comparison to the recommended daily allowances. I think in the US, you have the same thing on daily values. So you have to put the percentage of RDAs for vitamins and minerals. Here you have an example. Vitamin C per day, I have 160 milligram. This you have to declare it on your label. On top of that, you have to give the percentage RDA, which is 200% of the RDA, here in my case for vitamin C. So these represent all the mandatory provisions for food supplement labels in the EU. So you must comply with all these requirements. Otherwise, when you launch your product and you send your product label to authorities, they will come back to you and they will tell you, look, you are not giving the recommended daily dose, please do so, etc. So it's important to have a clean label in compliance with the law before you launch your product, obviously. Now we continue. We have put all the mandatory provisions on food supplement. Now we continue. You have other provisions to put on your label. It's not enough. You have to give instructions for use or storage conditions if that's needed. You have to give the net quantity of your product on the label again. You have to give the date of minimum durability. Here I will not enter into the details. It's quite technical, but if you do a label, email me, I can explain to you. What is important to know, if your food supplement is it's to be used for more than, let's say, 5 months, you have to give the months and the year. It's sufficient. So yeah, months and year is sufficient most of the time for food supplements. You have to give the load code. Again, do not forget about the load code. You have to put the address of a seller, distributor, manufacturer established in the EU. And this, very often, we see it missing on labels. For instance, for companies manufacturing in the US and using a distributor from outside of the EU, well, bear in mind that you have to put the address of a company established in the EU. And why that? Well, it's because authorities, in case there is a safety concern, they want to be able to contact someone quickly, but also for consumers. You know, if they have a question, they have to contact someone from the company. So don't forget to put the address of an EU company on the label, and not of a US or Asian company, for instance. And last, you have to put the list of ingredients, obviously. And the list of ingredients in the EU, the aim of the legislator, again, was to be as transparent as possible. And to declare on the label all the ingredients that you use in your product. For instance, we see many companies having trade names, ingredients like a blend with a trade name. Well, that is not valid for the EU. You have to give all the ingredients that you use in your product, you have to declare them on your label, and not the trade name of your blended or mixture of ingredients. Okay? And also in the EU, you have to know how to declare food additives. Again, if you use silicon dioxide in your product, you have to name the class of the additive, like anti-caking agent, for instance. You have to declare it on the label again. The same for allergens. In the EU, it's quite restrictive. You have to declare all the allergen ingredients on the label to inform the consumer. Okay? So this was an example of a label in compliance with EU legislation. Now, if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, we were talking about a new piece of legislation in the EU, the regulation on food labeling from 2011. It will be applicable in 2014, I explained at the beginning. And here I want to tell you about the relevance, the incidence of this new legislation on food supplements only. Not on foods in general, just on food supplements. What is new in this new regulation on food labeling for food supplements? Well, the first bullet point, now in the EU, if you are designing a label, you will have to respect a mandatory minimum font size. So you cannot have a very, very small font having 6 languages on your product. So you have to respect a minimum font size so that the consumer can read easily what is written on your label. And here I don't put the figure, but they have established a figure on what should be the font size on your label. They are very specific in the EU, as you can see. So the figure is 1.2 millimeter for the height of the letter on the label, 1.2 millimeter, okay? They have certain exceptions for very small packages, like a chewing gum or even some food supplement packages are very small. Here they have an exception. You can use 0.9 millimeter for the height of your letter, of your font. So you see, they are very specific. You have to comply with the font size on your label. And it's quite challenging, especially for food supplements. You have many things to put on your label, obviously. Many warning statements, all the list of ingredients, so you can see that it's quite challenging to put all their labeling provisions in one single pack. Huh? Not very much space left, let's say, for your commercial claims. Also, in this new regulation, what is new is about distance selling. I don't know if you're selling your products at distance via internet, etc. Well, here in the new regulation, they obliged you to give all the mandatory provisions on the label, well, before the purchase is concluded. Let's say you have a customer going to your website to buy your product. Well, before he buys the product, you have to give him all the mandatory particulars, the list of ingredients, if there is any allergen, the net weight, etc. So you see, it's quite demanding. Again, you have to provide information before the purchase is concluded. Okay, don't forget that. Another new element in the FIC, in the food labeling, regulation, is about nanomaterials. Again, if you use a nano ingredient in your formula, let's take an example, coenzyme Q10. It comes from nano. Well, you have to declare it in your list of ingredients. You put coenzyme Q10 and then in brackets nano. That's again a new element of the regulation to inform the consumer that your ingredient comes from nanomaterials. You understand why? I mean, the Commission wants to be very strict and to inform consumers that you may have nanomaterials in your product. Another new element in this regulation is about allergen labeling. So you know you have to declare any allergenic substance used in your product. You have to put it on the label. Okay. However, now in the new regulation, they obliged you to emphasize the presence of an allergen. You can put it in bold, in color, like in red, or in big size, big font. You have to really warn the consumer that you use an allergen ingredient. Soy, for instance, Or milk, you have to put it in bold or in red in a certain way as the consumer sees it immediately. Another new element. Then we continue. The country of origin. Under the new regulation, they have extended the obligation to label the country of origin for certain ingredients. For food supplements, what is important to know is that in 2014, the European Commission will issue a new report about whether or not the country of origin should be labeled for certain ingredients. For instance, for milk used in dairy products, they will consider whether or not you have to label the origin of milk. Another example, for an ingredient that represents more than 50% of your formula, they will consider whether or not you have to label the origin. So in the following years, let's say, you should be aware that the country of origin labeling may be extended, and they might oblige you to label the origin of certain ingredients. Another new element is about caffeine added for physiological purposes, so not as a flavor, but as an active ingredient. Again, if you add caffeine in your food supplement formula, you have to declare it in a certain way on your label. You have to put a statement contains caffeine, then you have to put a warning statement not recommended for children and pregnant women, and you have to declare the amount of caffeine per daily dose. So you see, they are very restrictive, again, with the use of caffeine. They want to inform consumers about the potential side effects of caffeine and to give the amount per day that your product contains. And last point, you may remember that we were talking about RDAs, recommended daily allowances. This has to do when you use a vitamin, you declare the daily dose, and you have to put the percentage of RDAs, like 100% of the RDAs. Well, in the new regulation, they have changed the wording. It's not anymore RDA for recommended daily allowances, it's NRV. They like a lot new words. So it's nutrient reference values. So in your label, you will have to declare the percentage NRV and not anymore RDA, just for you to know. So to conclude on this presentation on food supplement labeling, a checklist, what you have to check in order to have a label in compliance with EU and national legislations. So first of all, although the new regulation will become applicable in 2014, you have to already start being in compliance. You can already now apply the new elements. It's optional. It's your choice. You decide to comply with the new labeling regulation. And anyway, for you, if you design now a new product, it's really highly recommended to comply with the new regulation already now. Again, in the new regulation, if you open it, if you search for it on Google, you will find many rules on nutrition declaration. Be aware that for food supplements, this section is not applying. Nutrition declaration for food supplements does not apply. For food supplements, they simply ask you to declare the amount of active ingredients per daily dose. So the amount of fiber, of proteins, of carbohydrate, they don't want to know. This is not relevant to food supplement. Okay? Check whether the country where you're launching your product has any national warning statements. For instance, on certain botanicals, or we see in the UK on vitamin D, they have warning statements specific, so that you must put on your label. Last, follow all the guidance documents on tolerances and fiber. You may know that the Commission will adopt very soon a guidance document on tolerances and fiber. So follow all the developments on that. Tolerances, you know, it's the margin of tolerance that you may have in between the amount of vitamin in a product and what you declare on your label. You have a certain margin of tolerance in the difference between what is in your label and what you put what is in your product and what you declare on your label. This is what we call tolerance. Okay? And last, follow all the EU and national developments on the interpretation of the new labeling regulation. The Commission is now preparing a new question and answer document. They give answers to all the different points of interpretation of the regulation on food labeling. And also, for your information, in the UK, they are now doing a consultation, and companies can answer to that consultation and give their opinion about the new labeling regulation. So thank you for your attention. If you have a question. So I repeat the questions that everyone knows. Are there differences in between the EU regulation and national regulations on food labeling, right? Well, first of all, the food labeling regulation is an EU regulation. It's harmonized. So all countries will adopt it, in principle, in the same way, okay? So we don't have so many national differences. We have, for certain elements, like I was telling you on the use of certain ingredients, they have adopted warning statements that you have to put on your label. This is not relevant to food supplements, but to food in general, they have differences about GDA declaration, about front of pack, traffic lights, etc. So there are differences, yeah.